manner in which a person walks is usually noticed, but generally is not evaluated by the casual observer. But for those who study pathological walking, it is important to first understand normal walking. But what is normal walking or normal gait? Clinically speaking, normal walking has 5 attributes. Viewed at normal speed, it may be difficult to clearly identify each attribute, but when the motion is slowed, you can easily identify each one. 1 is stability in stance. 2 is foot clearance and swing. 3 is pre-positioning of the foot for initial contact. 4 is adequate step length. 5 relates to the energy used in walking. We call this energy conservation. In a child, ambulation begins with the prerequisites for these 5 attributes. Initially, the knees are relatively stiff, and the child walks with a wide base of support. Gradually, gait evolves toward the adult pattern as the toddler develops balance and equilibrium. Walking usually begins at about 1 year of age, but does not mature into an adult heel-toe gait until at least 3.5 years of age. Despite the fact that we all learn to walk without instruction, there is little deviation in walking pattern from one person to another. Any deviation from the normal walking pattern will interfere with efficiency and cause an increase in energy cost. To understand normal gait, you must know the basic terms associated with gait analysis. When describing human gait, it is conventional to do so in terms of the gait cycle. A complete gait cycle, or stride, begins when one foot strikes the ground and ends when the same foot strikes the ground again. The gait cycle is divided into 2 major phases, stance phase and swing phase. Stance phase begins with initial contact, which in normal gait is with the heel and ends at toe-off, when swing phase begins. Swing phase is defined as the period of time from toe-off until the foot hits the ground again. Each of these events in the gait cycle is defined sequentially as occurring at specific percentages of the cycle. The graph below will illustrate the cycle. Initial contact is defined as occurring at 0% and 100% of the gait cycle. During normal walking, toe-off occurs at approximately 60% of the cycle. Therefore, stance phase represents approximately 60% of the cycle, and swing phase makes up the other 40%. Opposite toe-off occurs at 10% of the cycle, and opposite heel strike occurs at 50%. This means that during walking there are 2 periods of double support, when both feet are on the ground. Each of these periods constitutes about 10% of the cycle. The first period of double support occurs immediately after initial contact. The second occurs just prior to toe-off. The first period of double support is referred to as loading response. It is a period of deceleration when the shock of impact is absorbed. This is followed by a period of single stance occupying about 40% of the cycle, during which the opposite limb is going through its swing phase. In walking, single support on the stance side must be equal to the period of swing of the opposite limb. The period of single stance can be subdivided into mid-stance and terminal stance. In late stance, there is a second period of double support called pre-swing. It begins at about 50% of the gait cycle and lasts until toe-off on the stance side. Pre-swing is the same event as loading response on the opposite side and is equal in time. Since normal gait is symmetrical, it is important to remember these relationships. Further characterization of the gait cycle can be done with temporal measurements such as walking velocity, cadence, step length, and stride length. Step length is defined as the longitudinal distance between the 2 feet. The right step is measured from the first point of contact of the trailing left foot to the first point of contact of the right foot. In normal walking, this would be the distance measured from heel strike of the left foot to heel strike of the right foot. Stride length is the distance covered during a complete gait cycle and represents the sum of the right and left step lengths. Stated differently, it extends from the initial contact of one foot to the following initial contact of the same foot. Cadence is the number of steps taken during a given amount of time, usually steps per minute. Walking velocity is expressed as a distance per time relationship, such as centimeters per second or meters per minute, and is equal to step length times cadence. A child and an adult can walk at the same velocity, but the child has a shorter stride and therefore a faster cadence. Walking velocity is constant after about age 5 or 6. However, as the lower extremities grow longer, step length increases and cadence slows. This continues until growth is complete. Gait analysis looks at gait in 3 dimensions. The sagittal plane is a side view. The sagittal plane allows viewing of the pelvic tilt and flexion and extension of the hip, knee, and ankle. Coronal plane is the view seen when someone is walking towards or away from you. In this plane, viewing of abduction and adduction of the hip and pelvic obliquity are best observed. Transverse plane is the view from above or below, showing rotational position of the limbs. In describing ambulation, we use the terms kinematics and kinetics. Kinematics are the parameters used in the description of locomotion, including joint angles, displacements, velocities, and accelerations. They are plotted on a graph as a function of time. A simple example of kinematics is the graph of the ankle. This is a typical kinematic graph of the ankle showing one complete walking cycle plotted along the x-axis or abscissa as percentage of the gait cycle. The degree of motion of the joint is plotted along the y-axis or ordinate. The graph begins at initial contact with the vertical dashed line representing toe-off. Kinetics include the parameters that cause the movement, such as ground reaction forces, muscle and ligament forces, joint moments, and joint powers. A moment of force is a force acting at a distance from the rotational center, causing the body to rotate. It is expressed as M equals F times D. A simple example is 2 children on a teeter-totter. Each child is creating a moment around the axle to which the teeter-totter is attached. If one child is lighter than the other and both sit the same distance from the axle, the lighter child rises in the air. The moment causes the rotation of the teeter-totter. The lighter child can balance a heavier child with no net moment or rotation produced if the lighter child sits further from the axis. The formula for this is Cm times D equals Cm times D. In the body, during quiet standing, the center of gravity is positioned such that the ground reaction force falls behind the hip, in front of the knee, and in front of the ankle. In relation to the body, these are considered external forces. In order for a person to maintain standing without falling, the external moments produced by the ground reaction force have to be balanced by internal moments. These are produced by the ligaments at the hip and knee and muscles at the ankle. An example of this, as it occurs in the body, is the plantar flexion knee extension couple. The muscle force which acts on the bone perpendicular to the axis of rotation will produce a moment about the joint center. M equals F times D. The moment is equal to the force times the distance. This moment can be calculated through a process called inverse dynamics if the ground reaction force and the locations of the joint centers are known. The bones are the lever arms on which these forces act, with the joint centers being the axes of rotation. The moment produced at a joint during walking times the rate or velocity at which the joint is bending is equal to the net power. Power equals force times distance times angular velocity. This basketball player is a good example. The faster the velocity prior to takeoff, the greater the power at takeoff. The mathematical definition of joint power is the product of the net joint moment times the joint angular velocity, or force times distance times joint angular velocity. When examining power production, we must look at the muscles which are the primary internal power producers. A muscle's ability to produce power is most directly affected by its cross-sectional area. However, other factors that also affect muscle power include the length-tension ratio, the degree of fatigue, and the fiber type, that is it fast or slow twitch. Muscles work in one of three ways. Concentric contraction is a shortening contraction that creates acceleration. An example would be the gastrocnemius during terminal stance. Eccentric contraction is a lengthening contraction. The muscle acts as a decelerator or shock absorber. An example would be the soleus during mid-stance. Isometric contraction is a stabilizing contraction. Most isometric contractions occur in postural muscles, but may occasionally occur in other muscle groups for brief periods of time. An example of muscles which are primarily stabilizers are the hip abductors in mid-stance. Kinetics are represented on the moment and power graphs. Like the kinematic graph, the abscissa or x-axis depicts the percentage of the Gait cycle, beginning at initial contact. The vertical line represents toe-off. On the moment graph, the ordinate or y-axis is the joint moment standardized for body weight. Power output is displayed on the y-axis of the power graph, also standardized for body weight. Power generation is considered positive. Power absorption is considered negative. In our example of the ankle, the concentric contraction is power generation. The eccentric contraction is power absorption. Now that we have a general idea of the principles involved in walking, let's look at the kinematics and kinetics of individual joints. We'll begin with the foot and ankle. Stance phase action of the ankle is described in terms of three rockers. First rocker begins at initial contact and extends through loading response. In normal gait, the fulcrum of first rocker is the heel. The position of the ankle at heel strike is a 90-degree angle, or neutral dorsiflexion. As the foot moves to being flat on the floor, the ankle plantar flexes, which on the kinematic graph is below the neutral line. The pretibial muscles are active during first rocker. They include the anterior tibialis, extensor digitorum longus, extensor hallucis longus, and peroneus tertius. Because the ground reaction force is passing through the heel at initial contact, the immediate effect is to thrust the entire foot towards the floor. The external moment created by gravity is resisted by the internal moment of the pretibial muscles as they undergo controlled eccentric contraction or lengthening. Eccentric contraction is always associated with deceleration. At the time of heel strike, the center of mass of the body is falling, and the ankle helps to decelerate it. Therefore, the purpose of first rocker is to decelerate the body's inertia at initial contact. That is, to cushion or absorb the impact. A force plate on the floor would measure about 140% of body weight at impact. The additional 40% represents the body's inertia. The muscle moment is named after the muscle groups which are acting at the time. During first rocker, the muscle moment is a dorsiflexor moment. Second rocker begins when the entire plantar surface of the foot is in contact with the floor and marks the beginning of mid-stance. The tibia advances over the planted foot with the fulcrum at the ankle. It is a period of increasing dorsiflexion. The motion graph shows a maximum of 10 degrees of dorsiflexion during the second rocker. During second rocker, the ground reaction force passes anterior to the joint center of the ankle. The external moment produced acts to drive the foot into further dorsiflexion. This moment is resisted by eccentric contraction of the plantar flexors, primarily by the action of the soleus. The purpose of second rocker is to control the position of the ground reaction force referable to the joints above. At the end of mid-stance, the combined action of the gastrocnemius and soleus arrests the forward progression of the tibia. The muscle moment during second rocker is a plantar flexor moment. The power graph shows a period of absorption because of the eccentric contraction of the plantar flexors. Here we can see that the gastrocnemius joins the soleus to end second rocker and produce an acceleration force that begins third rocker. This period of acceleration represents an important source of momentum to propel an individual through the walking cycle. Third rocker begins when the action of the plantar flexor muscles have fully arrested the forward progression of the tibia. This forces the fulcrum of the pivot forward to the metatarsal heads, and the heel rises off the ground. The kinematic graph shows a period of plantar flexion. The action of the plantar flexor has now switched from eccentric to concentric. Concentric contraction of muscle by definition produces acceleration. To maintain constant walking speed, the deceleration of the first two rockers must be balanced by the acceleration of the third. The acceleration force of third rocker peaks at the end of terminal stance and then falls rapidly to zero during pre-swing. Ankle swing phase begins at toe-off. To get the foot in the proper position for initial contact, the ankle must dorsiflex. Initial swing phase is strictly a period of dorsiflexion. The activity is created by the pre-tibial muscles and is concentric in nature. In mid-swing, the foot is in about 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. In terminal swing, the foot drops back to neutral under the force of gravity and the eccentric contraction of the tibialis anterior. The knee's action during the gait cycle is coordinated with what is happening at the hip and ankle. At initial contact, the knee is in a position of nearly full extension. As first rocker occurs at the ankle, the knee undergoes an initial phase of flexion to about 15 degrees, at which time the foot is flat on the floor. This serves two purposes. One is to absorb the impact of the body at heel strike. The other is to minimize the vertical translation of the center of mass. The name for this part of the gait cycle is loading response. Comparing normal gait with a stiff leg gait shows the difference in vertical translation of the center of mass. Minimizing the translation of the center of mass conserves energy. During loading response, as the body weight is accepted with increasing knee flexion, the resultant ground reaction force falls behind the knee and produces an external flexion moment. To prevent the collapse of the knee into excessive flexion, the single joint muscles of the quadriceps, the vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and vastus lateralis, are acting eccentrically to absorb energy and to counteract the external flexion moment. At initial contact, the moment is variable because the knee begins in relative extension. From initial contact through loading response, the moment becomes extensor, and the three vasti muscles control the knee and prevent collapse. In mid-stance, the period of second rocker, the knee is extending as the limb moves over the planted foot. The ground reaction force is anterior to the knee, creating an external extension moment. Because external forces are acting to extend the knee, the internal forces resist this via a flexor moment. There is no muscle action at this time since the knee counteracts the moment by internal ligamentous forces. Terminal stance begins with heel rise, which is also the period of third rocker. As the ankle plantar flexes, the knee begins to flex so that by toe off, knee flexion has reached 45 degrees. As flexion increases, the center of mass falls behind the knee joint, creating an external flexion moment. The internal moment at the knee, therefore, is extensor. The rectus femoris occasionally has a period of activity in pre-swing and initial swing when it acts eccentrically to control the velocity of the increasing knee flexion. Therefore, power is absorbed. The action of the knee in swing phase is much more complex. When walking at a natural pace, flexion and extension of the knee are completely passive. The leg acts as a compound pendulum. Cadence, therefore, can only be altered by muscle action. During initial swing, the knee is in a period of increasing flexion. Because of the pendulum mechanism, during rapid cadence, the knee would flex excessively if it were not restrained by the rectus femoris, which acts as a decelerator at the knee to prevent excessive flexion. At the same time, the rectus femoris acts concentrically at the hip as an accelerator. Therefore, the muscle works like a door spring, transferring energy from leg to hip. Mid-swing is a transition period with no muscle activity across the knee joint. The joint has passed through peak knee flexion during initial swing when the ankle was still in maximum plantar flexion. Terminal swing is a period of knee extension which is controlled by eccentric action of the hamstrings. At the end of terminal swing, the knee is in almost complete extension. During first rocker, as the ankle is plantar flexing and the knee is flexing, the hip enters the cycle in 35 degrees of flexion and begins to extend. The ground reaction force is anterior to the hip joint, creating an external flexion moment, so the action of the hip extensors are required to prevent collapse into flexion. The gluteus maximus, gluteus minimus, and hamstrings are contracting concentrically to produce an acceleration moment at the hip joint. The hamstrings can work as hip extensors at this time because the knee is stabilized by the three vasti, the single joint muscles of the quadriceps. The hip continues to extend during mid-stance until the ground reaction force moves posterior to the hip. During the first part of mid-stance, the concentric extensor moment continues and acts to accelerate the body forward and upward. During the last part of mid-stance, the ground reaction force passes posterior to the hip joint and extension becomes passive. The internal moment becomes an eccentric flexor moment. Therefore, no muscle action is required as hip extension is resisted by the tension force of the iliofemoral ligament. During terminal stance, the period of third rocker, the ankle is plantar flexing, the knee is flexing, and the hip continues to extend. The hip is now in full extension at approximately 5 degrees beyond neutral. The internal moment is an eccentric flexor moment. At the end of terminal stance, concentric action of the gastrocnemius and the position of the ground reaction force combine to drive the knee forward into flexion, producing flexion of the hip as well. In pre-swing, just prior to toe-off, power becomes concentric, and the hip actively begins to flex. This is accomplished by contraction of the hip flexors, including the iliopsoas, and, if gait is rapid, the rectus femoris. Peak hip flexor power occurs at toe-off, which marks the onset of swing phase. The iliopsoas continues to act during initial swing as it accelerates the hip into flexion. The hip continues to flex until mid-swing, at which point flexion remains constant until initial contact, when extension begins again. In rapid gait, the rectus femoris restrains knee flexion and transfers the inertial energy of the shank to augment hip flexion. The iliopsoas comes on later in pre-swing and initial swing. Kinematics of the coronal plane are fairly simple. The pelvis and hips mirror each other, and the collateral ligaments of the knee and ankle essentially prevent coronal plane knee and ankle motion. Kinematic analysis of the pelvis and hip in the coronal plane show that at initial contact, the pelvis is level, and the hip is in neutral abduction-adduction. As loading response begins, the stance side of the pelvis rises 5 degrees, with the stance hip going into adduction. The unsupported swing side of the pelvis drops about 5 degrees. This pelvis motion reduces energy expenditure by minimizing the vertical excursion of the center of mass. Dropping of the pelvis on the unsupported side during loading response is caused by the ground reaction force on the supported limb. The ground reaction force falls medial to the ankle, knee, and hip, which produces an external adduction moment at all joints of the stance limb. The external adduction moment is resisted at the hip by eccentric control of the hip abductors, at the knee by the ligaments, and at the ankle by the lateral ligaments and the peroneals. The pelvic and hip motion reverses in mid-stance as concentric control of the hip abductors of the stance limb act to raise the pelvis and to assist with clearance on the swing side. During terminal stance and double support, the pelvis on the stance side goes into abduction in preparation for toe-off. Swing phase begins with the pelvis dropped down and the hip in abduction. Near the end of initial swing, the stance side hip abductors begin to act concentrically to lift the pelvis. By the end of swing, the pelvis and hip are in a relatively neutral position. We don't normally view walking from above or below, so the transverse plane kinematics may not be familiar. The purpose of transverse plane motion is stride elongation. This is accomplished by pelvic rotation, which in turn requires a compensatory hip rotation to keep the lower extremity in the line of progression. This rotation is controlled chiefly by the adductor magnus. During the first half of stance, the adductor magnus works on the fixed front limb to produce internal rotation of the pelvis and hip. The superficial hip adductors act in pre-swing and initial swing to advance the trailing back limb. At initial contact, the pelvis is at its maximum anterior or forward position. It maintains its forward position until mid-stance, where it begins to move posteriorly, reaching its maximum posterior position at toe-off. Here, the rotation once again reverses to prepare for initial contact. The total magnitude of this rotation is 8 to 10 degrees. To provide maximum reach for the swinging limb, maintain the limb close to midline, and allow pelvic rotation, hip rotation is internal until opposite heel strike. It then reverses to external rotation until the next period of double support. After this, internal rotation begins again. Foot rotations remain fairly constant throughout stance phase at about 4 degrees external to the line of progression. For the foot to stay in constant position on the floor during stance, the rotations of the thigh and shank must be accommodated. This occurs through the subtalar joint complex and through the knee. In swing phase, less external rotation occurs at toe-off to allow appropriate push-off at the first and second metatarsal heads. The foot maintains a position of slight external rotation throughout the swing phase. In conclusion, we return to the 5 attributes of normal walking, which are frequently lost in pathological gait. Stability in stance is challenged by 2 factors: an abnormal foot position, which creates an unstable weight-bearing surface, and/or compromised balance caused by the lack of trunk and lower body motor control. The second attribute of normal walking is clearance in swing. A challenge to this can be created by loss of knee motion or inadequate dorsiflexion. Appropriate prepositioning of the foot for initial contact is the third attribute. It allows for efficient energy transfer between body segments and is compromised by inadequate foot positioning in terminal swing. The fourth attribute is adequate step length, including a means of progressing the body forward. This can be hampered by inadequate knee extension in terminal swing, an unstable foot on the stance side, or inadequate plantar flexor push-off from the stance side. The fifth attribute is conservation of energy. Of all the prerequisites for normal walking, energy conservation and its measurement actually encompasses and measures the total deviation of the other 4 prerequisites. The key to efficient gait is energy conservation. Walking is a constant interplay and transformation between kinetic energy and potential energy. When a person is compensating for a gait deviation, the transfer of energy is less efficient and more energy is used. 3 important mechanisms by which the body conserves energy are: 1. Minimizing the excursion of the center of gravity. 2. Controlling momentum. 3. Active or passive transfer of energy between body segments. Minimizing the excursion of the center of gravity occurs by the 3 pelvic rotations and coordinated knee and ankle motion. Control of forward momentum occurs by eccentric contraction of the soleus during mid-stance. Active transfer of energy between non-adjacent segments requires coordination of timing and control. It is the major role of the 2 joint muscles. An example of this is the coordinated action of the rectus femoris muscle at both the knee and the hip, allowing both hip flexion and knee flexion at the same time at different ends of the muscle. Measurement of energy costs is accomplished in several ways. Estimation of mechanical energy by segmental analysis. Estimation of mechanical energy by inverse dynamics. Estimation of metabolic energy by heart rate and speed. Metabolic measurement by oxygen consumption and carbon dioxide output. Gait is a complex set of movement, moments, powers, forces, coordination, and balance, all working together to form what is commonly called walking. Knowing the principles of normal gait will help in understanding the mechanisms of pathological gait.